Welcome back to the Vanderbilt Sports and Society podcast. I'm Andrew Maraniss, and really delighted to have David Axelrod with us today. David, I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since I heard it could be a possibility. David is a senior political commentator for CNN, former senior advisor to President Obama, and no stranger to podcasts, a host of the Axe Files podcast and Axe on Tap. David, thanks again for coming to Vanderbilt and joining us.
It's great to be here. As I've told you, the Maraniss name is a big name in my world. So your dad was a young political journalist when I was an even younger political journalist, but his work, all his works were just fantastic. So, and he's just a great person, as your mom is. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. All right, so here's a big question for you. Here we are at the end of August. In several weeks, we'll have an answer to a question that's on the minds of a lot of Americans right now, and I think you're uniquely qualified to answer this. And the question is, of course, who's worse, 62 Mets or the 2024 White Sox?
Yeah, this is a painful question. Look, I'm from New York, first of all. So the New York Mets of 62 was my first team. I mean, I was a little boy, and I would go to the Polo Grounds and watch the Mets play. And, of course, Casey Stengel, the manager, famously said, "I manage so good, how come they play so bad?" But I have to say, and Jerry Reinsdorf, who owns the White Sox, is a very, very close friend of mine. But this is a painful, painful year. I mean, I think they're well on their way to making the exact wrong kind of history. And you know, at least the 62 Mets had an excuse. It was their first year of existence, and they had colorful characters. You know, when you start an expansion team, you get to dress. So they had some old Dodgers and Giants, and you know, I think Don Zimmer may have been on that team. He was, or if he didn't, he got there in '63. And they had these guys like Choo Choo Coleman and Pumpsy Green, who were, if nothing else, these kinds of players had great names.
Yeah, I saw that Vinegar Ben Mizell was on that team, right?
I mean, it's just like, I think people got chosen just for their names on that team.
Choo Choo Coleman.
Yeah.
Marv Throneberry.
Yeah.
Quite a
Marv
collection.
Throneberry. You know, Marv Throneberry he could hit, but he wasn't the brightest guy in the world, and made a lot of errors and stuff. When he turned, I was at a game where he missed first base several times when he was rounding the bases, got called out on appeals play. I mean, it's bad enough to do it once, but multiple times in a game. When Casey Stengel turned 75, they brought out a big birthday cake for him, you know, and after the game, Throneberry said, "Skip, I didn't get a birthday cake on my birthday." And Stengel said, "Yeah, because you drop it." So they were fun in that way. I mean, they were fun.
Right.
They were,
kind of lovable losers.
They were lovable. And then, of course, when they won the World Series, it was the Miracle Mets. It was the most incredible thing. We should talk about that a little bit later. But these White Sox, they're not lovable. You know, it's painful. It's been a painful season. I will tell you, it's the first time in all my years as a season's ticket holder for any team where the team offered you a 10% discount for the following season.
Right. You know, it's been a bad year when that's the case.
Yeah. But I mean, I really hope they come out of it quickly, because the city deserves better. I think Jerry deserves better. And I'm just hoping that I'm hoping for better things in the coming years.
Yeah. So you mentioned growing up in New York. You were born, I think, as the Giants and Dodgers were just about to leave.
They left. Yeah, I was born, and they left. I mean, I was not aware.
Right. Did you come from a Giants or Dodgers family?
Yeah. So my father was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, and I think he arrived in the Bronx, and I think that he learned how to play baseball before he learned English. And he played with Hank Greenberg and some of the great old players of that day, and he became an all-city pitcher and actually got a college scholarship to LIU to pitch. But he was a Giants fan. He hated the Yankees, and like you would in New York. You know, you choose your team and then you hate the others. I remember in the 60s he called them the portrait of corporate privilege, which was really, an advanced, you can certainly append that to them now.
Right.
But he was a Giants fan, and then we became Mets fans. But because he was a Giants fan and because I love baseball, Willie Mays was my favorite player of all time. And I have so many memories of going to see Willie first at the Polo Grounds and then at Shea. And then sadly at the end of his career when they brought him up, when he just really wasn't,
right.
He wasn't equipped, to be who people expect him. But absolutely the greatest player I ever saw. I got to tell you a story about this. When I was in the White House, Ernie Banks came by. Oh, wow. And I had an autographed ball from Willie Mays in my office at the White House. And he came in, and Willie's signature is it's completely unrecognizable unless you knew him. And he comes in, he sees the ball, says, Willie Mays, the greatest of all time. And I said, Ernie, I was trying to be polite, and I said, Ernie, I bet you there are people who say that about you. And he was like, he just swatted that away. He said, listen, he said, I wasn't even in his league. He said, when Willie was on the field, every other player was excited to see what he would do that day. He was just in a class by himself. But anyway, I digress.
You have that respect from other Hall of Famers. I mean, that says a lot.
It says a lot. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. My grandfather grew up in Coney Island and was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. And the story goes that he was watching the famous Bobby Thompson game, holding my dad, who was an infant at the time, and was so upset when that shot around the world was hit that he threw my dad to the ground. And so we pretty much blamed that for all of his
and thus he became a journalist.
right. That's your head injury.
So I did a podcast. So the first Axe Files podcast, I'm coming up on my 600th episode.
Congrats.
But the first one was with Bernie Sanders. And I asked him about growing up in Brooklyn, and I said, "Were you were a Dodgers fan?" He said, "Absolutely, I was a Dodgers fan." And I said, "You must have been pretty upset when they left." He said, "There were 3 names you could not mention in my household. There was Hitler, there was Stalin, and there was Walter O'Malley." And he says, "And I'm not even going to tell you which order."
Which order, right? Yeah. That's great. All right, so moving on to the late 60s, you mentioned the Miracle Mets in 69. I know before that you were, a teenager that was excited about RFK.
Yes.
I'm doing a book now on the first Special Olympics, which took place in Chicago in 1968.
Boy, I'd love to talk to you about that. I know a lot about that.
Okay.
Yes, I have a child who participates in the Special Olympics to this day. My daughter Lauren has special needs, and she's a proud Special Olympian. If those gold medals they gave out were actually gold, we could melt them down and we'd be wealthier than Elon Musk. But But I knew I'm obviously I'm friendly with the Shrivers.
Okay.
But also this wonderful woman Ann Burke in Chicago. And I got some great stories about that.
Oh, I'd love to talk to you about that. I've been up to Chicago to meet Ann.
One of the nicest people you'll ever meet.
Absolutely.
One of the greatest people you'll ever meet.
And so in working on that book and just thinking about the context in which it took place, 1968, such a tumultuous year, so much violence and assassinations, protests, a lot going on in society. And yet around the same time, a year later, 69, your team is having the season of a lifetime. Like, what was it like to be a sports fan at that time?
Oh my goodness, it was.
But did it seem like irrelevant to what was going on?
No, it was a great escape. Okay. I mean, that's the great thing about sports. It's something you can feel passionately about, and no one dies. But I'll tell you something. I mean, and I shouldn't give this away, perhaps, because maybe there's another documentarian out there who will steal this idea. But it is my hope to do this project because there were 2 parallel stories in 1969 in the city of New York. And I'll get to the other teams, the Knicks and the Jets as well, because it was like the trifecta in that 1-year period. But in the 60s, we already covered the fact that the Mets were abysmal for the first, until later in the decade. But in New York elected a mayor in 1965 named John Lindsay. John Lindsay was a liberal Republican who defeated the Tammany Hall machine. If you want to know what a liberal Republican is for our listeners, go to a museum of natural history, and they usually have one stuffed and on display. But
gone extinct, huh?
But Republican politics changed radically in the late '60s after the passage of the Civil Rights Acts, and there was a real backlash to those. By the time Lindsay ran for re-election in 1969, he was actually defeated in the Republican primary, but was still a candidate on the Liberal Party line in New York. Some aides in his office had this notion that he should start going to Mets games because something was happening and he should be associated with what was happening. And so he'd go to games. He wasn't really a baseball fan, and he would get impatient and he'd want to leave. No, we're going to stay, so on. But it became known that he was going to the Mets games. I think, and I'm asserting this, but I think it's true that the next day I think the Daily News, but one of the papers, there was after they won the World Series, there was a picture of Lindsay in the clubhouse and the players pouring champagne over his head. John Lindsay won a three-way race on the Liberal Party line in 1969. And this wasn't the only reason, but it was one of the reasons that the city was so swept up in euphoria about the Mets that a lot of other pain and a lot of other concerns faded away. And I think that he was partly swept along by that, and his association with the Mets was meaningful.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Thinking about that game when they win the World Series.
Yeah.
Cleon Jones makes the catch. The game's over. Game 5. I'm a Milwaukee Brewers fan. I was 12 years old, the one and only time they went to the World Series. I remember crying when Gorman Thomas struck out against Bruce Sutter to end the Game 7. Like, where were you when the Mets won the World Series? What was the story at your house?
I was watching on TV, and it was like unbelievable. I mean, I had gone to a bunch of games during the year, and I went to, I guess, a playoff game. That was the first year of the playoffs.
The division. Yes, yeah. It was. Yes.
So, I was really emotionally invested in this, and it felt like a miracle. I mean, first of all, the way they won the series, they had the greatest young pitching staff. But they were also just fun. They were like, one of the reasons I wanted to do this documentary is, in a way, it was maybe the end of an era of innocence, but they were just a bunch of kids playing baseball. And, Tom Seaver, who was, I think, one of the absolute greatest pitchers of all time. But, they had a whole bunch. Jerry Koosman.
Nolan Ryan on that team,
Nolan
right?
Ryan was a spare part in the pen. There was this sense of joy around that team that was just completely enchanting. And I always remember them appearing on the Ed Sullivan Show after they won the World Series, and they sang "You Gotta Have Heart" from Damn Yankees, which was all about miracles. And it was just a really joyful thing. And then, I was also a huge basketball fan. Okay. The Knicks won the title. First, the Jets win another miraculous, the Super Bowl in '69. And then in '70, the Mets, the Knicks win. So that was really '70 when
was happening within a year.
It was like, I was in sports heaven during that period of time. And the world was completely messed up, and I was very consumed by that on the one hand. On the other hand, I was living a dream to see all my teams, none of whom were particularly good for a lot of my childhood. All of a sudden, New York was the sports mecca of the world, which New Yorkers always believed, but it actually was at that time.
Yeah. Well, Bill Bradley's book was A Sense of Where You Are. That's one of my favorite sports books of all time.
Fantastic. I've gotten to know him, and I did a couple of podcasts with him, and to hear him sort of talk about basketball. And, he said, I talked to him during his about his. There's a new documentary, like a one-man show, Bill Bradley talking about his life, which seems improbable, but it's really engaging. But he says in the doc, and he said on my podcast, like, that was the greatest experience of his life, to be part of that team. There is something, and I feel this way about a great campaign, when my Obama campaigns, to be a part of something where you work communally toward a great goal, where everybody counts and you're relying on your teammate, and you're great because all the parts are great. Phil Jackson used to tell the Bulls, he used to share this old Native American saying, which is, the strength of the wolf is the pack, and the strength of the pack is the wolf. And so Bill Bradley really understood that. Those Knicks teams understood that, as the great Bulls teams did. And of course, Phil Jackson was on the Knicks teams. That it's all about how you play together. It's like a great band. You may be a bunch of great musicians, but if you don't play together, it's not good music. If you play together, it can be great.
So would you say that some of your ability as a campaign strategist, would you credit any of it to sports, like watching these teams, or did you play on teams that have great coaches yourself?
I wouldn't say I had great coaches, and I wouldn't say that I was a great player, but I was a great student of great players and great coaches. And later on, I did a piece for The New Yorker about the 2016 Cubs, and I spent a lot of time with Joe Madden when he managed those teams. And his philosophy of leadership and creating community was really meant something to me. I mean, obviously, I did the Obama campaigns before that, but I'm influenced by John Wooden, by Bill Walsh, and the way he built something great in San Francisco and their philosophies. I think there is Jimmy Breslin once said that political writing is the first cousin of sports writing. Political campaigns are the first cousin of sports campaigns.
Okay.
And I think you can learn a lot from watching how great teams succeed when you're building campaigns.
You've written about losing your father to suicide, and when I think about my relationship with my grandfather, with my dad, probably 80-90% of our conversations are about the Brewers or the Packers. Like, how much was sports a part of your relationship with your dad, and how did your relationship with sports change after you lost him?
That's such a great question. My parents split up when I was young, and I spent all my weekends with my dad. We had two teams in New York, the Mets and the Yankees. And unless it was raining, we spent every weekend at the ballparks. And, now I have sons and grandchildren, and we have the same relationships as you do, as I did. I mean, we talk about a lot of things, but we always end up talking about sports. And when I go to a ball game with my sons, I kind of feel my dad sitting there. It's like it's a thing that connects us, and it's really important to me. And now I'm breaking in my grandkids, and so to have my grandkids, taking my grandkids to ball games. They're still very young. They like the spectacle more than they understand the event, although they pay attention. So it's really, really important. And it was a huge bond between my dad and me. I told you, baseball to him was so fundamental. And but the great thing about baseball, my wife, Susan, we met on we playing co-ed basketball.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Did you impress her with a Euro step or some sort of move?
My game was fairly one-dimensional, but it was pretty effective, which I had a very weird shot, but I could shoot it from very long distances. And she, on the other hand, on the other hand, was a great athlete. And she was just lithe and, fun to watch out there. And she was smart, knew how to play the game. It's one of the reasons why, by the way, I really like women's basketball. I'm a season's ticket holder of the Chicago Sky,
right.
and I love watching Caitlin Clark, who I think is one of the great players that I've ever seen, honestly. But the women, because they can't overpower each other, really play the game the way the game is supposed to be played, and I really enjoy it. But anyway, so I digress again. But Susan hates baseball because she says it's too slow. And that's not an uncommon complaint. And I always say to her, you go to a basketball game, a hockey game, a football game. When you go to a baseball game, you say, I'm going to the ballpark. There's something more than just the game. It's sitting outside with someone you love and just sharing an afternoon. And the game is, I love the game and I pay attention to the game, but I also appreciate the moments in between. Now, I think speeding up the game was a smart thing for baseball to do, but there's something magical about just being at the ballpark, and I try and get there as much as I possibly can still.
We have a goal with our kids who are now 13 and 11 to get them to every major league stadium by the time they're out of the house. So as a family, we've been to 22 stadiums.
Oh,
now.
wow, that's great.
It's been, like you say, though, we try to get there as soon as the gates open, watch batting practice, experience the whole stadium. It's a great way to see the country, but it's been definitely passing down a family
That's a
love.
gift, not only now, but that'll be a gift because this is it is something you hand off to your kids. And I'm grateful to my dad for the time we spent together and the time we spent together at the ballpark.
So you have Cubs, White Sox, Bulls, and Sky season tickets? Is that right?
I have Bulls, Cubs, White Sox, and Sky. Yes, the only ones I don't. I'm not a hockey fan because my dad wasn't a hockey fan, so I rarely go to a Blackhawks game. I do go to Bears games, but I usually kind of skim off of friends
because they're as a Packers
they're going to be
fan,
great this year. By the way, the Bears are on the cusp of becoming something really, really great. This kid Caleb Williams is the real deal. I was at the last preseason game where he played, and there were just a couple of plays where you saw, wow, this guy is going to be something special.
They get it right like once out of every 39 quarterbacks, I feel like.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. No, I think he's the next Sid Luckman.
Okay, so speaking of the Bulls, you had a
talk about magic.
Front row seat to watching one of the all-time dynasties and one of the all-time icons of the game. And of course, I'm talking about Will Perdue.
Yes.
Vanderbilt alum.
We are so grateful to the Commodores for making Will Perdue available to us. Yes, he was an integral part of our great team. He's still an announcer up there,
I was at a game last year. He was judging the halftime dunk contest.
I see him broadcasting, and I guess I didn't pay enough attention to how much he gestures a lot, and he's got enormous hands. Yeah. It reminded me of what Ray Meyer once said about Mark Aguirre. They said, well, how does he have such control of the ball? And Ray Meyer said, he's got hands like toilet seats. And same as Will Perdue. He's got hands that are so enormous.
You used to go to a lot of DePaul games too?
It's a podcast.
Right? Yeah. Did you went to the DePaul games?
Eventually I had kids and I had to make some sacrifices to the realities of life. But also DePaul was a great team when I was a kid reporter in the 70s, and I had the money to buy a bunch of season tickets when they still were affordable.
Yeah.
And so the Mark Aguirre teams,
right.
I watched DePaul.
Yeah, those were great teams. Terry Cummings was, I was a fan of him as a Bucks fan.
Yeah.
All right, so back to actually Michael Jordan was maybe a little bit better than Will Perdue, but both key cogs on those teams.
I would think Michael would say he learned a lot from Will Perdue.
Okay. One political type of question for you. So Jordan criticized, especially in retrospect, that here he is, best player in the game, and didn't really speak out. Do you feel like athletes, especially extremely high-profile athletes like that, have any obligation to speak out on issues, or is that not an obligation that any individual person has?
I think they have an obligation to contribute to society, to contribute to communities in whatever way they deem possible. You know, what happened with Michael was Harvey Gantt was running for the Senate in North Carolina. You know, he would have been the first African-American senator since, Ed Brooke, but one of the first since Reconstruction. And he was running against Jesse Helms. And so people were like, how could you not take a position on this? And, you know, Michael ascribed to him, I don't know if it's true or not, you know, said, you know, even Republicans wear shoes. But I guess what I say is I never went to watch Michael Jordan play because of his political views. I went to watch him play because he was the greatest player of all time, and I was privileged to watch him play because he was the greatest player of all time. And you know, I don't think he was under obligation to be the political figure I wanted, or in any, you know, that wasn't, you know. So I used to tell my friends when they'd bring that up, listen, that's not why I root for Michael Jordan, and, you know, I'm not going to root against him because of it either. I used to take my boys to those games, you know, and I would say, guys, they were young, and say, guys, you should pay attention because this is the Babe Ruth of basketball. There'll never be another one like him. And I think now they look back at it and they realize that, but then it was just like his extraordinary play seemed ordinary. It's like, of course we're going to win. Michael's on the court, you know. Of course we're going to be playing in June. They wouldn't make plans in June. You know, they didn't want to go to camps in June because, well, we'll miss the playoffs. It's like, you know, it's not guaranteed that, Dad, you know, Michael's going to get us there. But I, you know, listen, I admire LeBron for not just for the stances that he takes, most of which I am in accord with, but more than that, for what he's meant to his hometown in Ohio, Akron. And, you know, and I think Michael actually has done a lot that doesn't get publicized in terms of philanthropy. And I kind of admire him for that, for not having it publicized.
That's right.
So there are all kinds of ways. I'm doing a podcast, I hope, in September with DeMar DeRozan, who just left the Bulls, who's doing a lot on mental health. He's had struggles with depression, and it's really helpful when people who are prominent are willing to talk about that. And, you know, this is a big issue in my life because my dad did die by suicide, and so I talk a lot about that and about depression. So athletes can, if they want to, be a real force because they are celebrities and they have a platform and they can use the platform that way, but they're not under obligation to. And I don't think Michael was under obligation to. You know, like I said, I think it's good to contribute back. By the way, I ran into at the convention Joakim Noah.
Oh, yeah.
Who was a great
thorn in
member
the
of the
side
Bulls.
of the Commodores when
No,
he was
I know
a
he
Gator.
was. I know he was. Mostly everybody who played against him hated him because he played with such ferocity.
Right.
Everybody who was on his side loved the joy of him. But more than that, he started anti-violence programs in Chicago, including this peace tournament every summer. And he has gang members come from different gangs, and they're assorted randomly on teams, and it's really a great exercise. But he has an art and sports program that his mother helped develop with him that he still runs in Chicago. Doesn't live there anymore, but he's kept that up. And, you know, I'm just so proud of him for the leadership he's provided. So it's good when athletes make that kind of an impact, and more of them do than don't. But that's not why you should root for an athlete. You should root for an athlete because they're great at what they do, and they entertain us and they thrill us. And so I try and take a light touch on it.
Yeah, no, I'm really interested in that topic. I have a series of books for little kids, like first, second, and third graders, called Beyond the Game. about athletes that do step up and do something beyond. So LeBron and what he's done in Akron is a subject of one. Maya Moore, who worked to free Jonathan Irons, doing one on a Native American woman now that raises awareness of murdered and missing Indigenous women. So maybe Joakim Noah could be the next subject.
Yeah, you should. I mean, he's worthy. He's worthy of it. Yeah.
So you're arriving in Nashville after having been at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Tim Walz, a lot made of him being a former high school football coach.
Although Trump was quick to say he was only an assistant coach.
Yeah, right. So. Which he riled up thousands of assistant coaches around the country by saying that.
Well, everybody on that team seems to credit him with being the spirit behind the team. I guess he was the linebackers coach, but
if you were advising a campaign and there was what does it mean to be a high school coach? It seems like that's something that so many people can relate to, in their town. And
listen, if I were the campaign, I'd be sending him every weekend. I'd have him at a high school football game on Friday night. I'd have him do color on a college game on Saturday.
Yeah.
It's so, the great thing about sports is we can have really, really deep differences about politics and find kinship around sports. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, I think sports reminds us that there actually are other things than politics that unite us as human beings, as Americans. Sports is one of those things. So I think that is a great asset that they should make use of.
So debate's coming up soon. The day before my sister got married, my future brother-in-law had his bachelor party, which was to play paintball. And someone shot him in the forehead. And so at his wedding, he had a giant welt on his face. And I was reading a story that the day of a presidential debate, you almost caused an injury to President Obama.
That was bad. Yeah, we were in Philadelphia. It was a primary debate, actually, but an important one. It was in the fall of 2007. And we always used to play pickup ball before debates just to get him loose. And, it was a tension relaxer. And somehow on a switch, I ended up covering him, which was a bit of a mismatch. We are not
in what way?
Well, in the way that he's slim and lithe and quick, and I'm a little bit on the heavier set side, slow-footed, and so on. So he did what he sensibly should have, and he tried to slash right by me, and I did what I do instinctively, and I raked him across the nose as he passed, and he went down. And there were Secret Service guys there. They run over there. I thought they were going to taser me. And I was after a while, he said, "Axe, you almost broke my nose on the day of a big debate." And my first concern was worry for him, and my second was I kind of saw my career flash before my eyes right there. I don't think it's ever been done before, and I hope no one ever tries that again.
Well, that's a great story to end on. David, thank you for taking the time to do this. We're really excited you're here at Vanderbilt to talk about maybe some more important topics, but no more interesting topics tonight.
Listen, I could talk for hours with you, Andrew, on this particular topic. Sports has been such a for reasons I hope are clear, such an important part of my life and so many people's lives. So happy to sit with you.
All right, thank you so much. Take care.